Okay, Module 2, Poisoning and First Aid. So what we're going to talk about in Module 2, we're going to identify the routes of entry of pesticides into the body, identify common signs and symptoms of poisoning, explain what is meant by LD50, differentiate between acute and chronic toxicity, list essential information required in case of an emergency, and then assisting a person in the case of poisoning. Okay, poisoning. So a poison is a substance that causes injury, illness, or death. The potency of a poison is determined by its toxicity. Pesticides are toxic to the target pest and may also be toxic to other organisms, including humans. So how poisons enter the body. So we talked a little bit about this in Module 1. They can be ingested. So this would be entering by swallowing contaminated food, from unclean hands, eating lunch without washing your hands, biting fingernails. These are methods that a poison can enter your body through ingestion. I have this in bold because you need to understand that, ingestion is entering through the mouth orally, contaminated food or unwashed hands. The other method is inhalation, so breathing in vapor or dust into the lungs, and then absorption through eyes or skin. It's important to understand the genitalia area is the highest absorption rate through the skin. Okay, so guys, you need to be aware of this when you're going to kick the tire on the tractor, when you're out in the field. So make sure your hands are clean. Exposure routes. So here's another diagram. So inhalation in through the nose or mouth, nose into the lungs, oral through the mouth down into the digestive system, and then dermally would be through the skin or even through the eyes. Okay, symptoms, mild, moderate, or severe. I guarantee any of you who've been dealing with chemicals, spraying over the years, including myself. I have been an applicator for over 20 years, and guaranteed those of us who've been around chemicals long enough have probably experienced at least mild symptoms. This could be a headache, maybe a sore throat, maybe a cough, or maybe you're just not feeling good after a day of spraying, or maybe the next morning you're not feeling good. So these can be indications of poisoning symptoms. Well, it's so important to be using the proper PPE when using these chemicals. So here's the absorption rates on the body. Of course, as I said, genitalia area being the highest absorption rate, down to the forearm being the lowest. Okay, so highest is the genital area, then your ear canal would be the second highest. And when you think about it, ear protection doesn't always need to be worn just from loud noises, but you're actually blocking an entry route for chemical into your ear. So ear canal, forehead, so it's important. Ball caps definitely are not recommended while spraying chemicals, because your hat can absorb that chemical and then remain in your hat, and as you sweat and wear it, you could be poisoning yourself. So some of the things to avoid wearing here on the left are fabric baseball caps, cloth or leather gloves, shoes or boots. Leather is really absorbent. A natural rubber or plastic glove. So you should be using a nitrile glove. Leather belts or wrist or watch bands. And then avoid wearing contact lenses as well. Okay, so you need to know to some degree this this diagram. Okay, so mild symptoms, I've already talked about a few. So headache, fatigue, irritation of skin, eyes, throat, loss of appetite, nausea, dizziness, perspiration, weakness, and diarrhea. These are all considered mild symptoms. And that's why I say those of you, including myself, who've been using chemicals for years, sometimes we can get a little bit complacent, with the PPE or whatever the case might be. And I know I've had headache and fatigue, in the years that I have worked with chemicals. So it's something we need to be aware of and not become complacent about. So those are mild symptoms. Moderate symptoms, of course, a little bit more just a little bit more like trembling, loss of coordination, blurred vision, mental confusion, rapid pulse, pressure in your chest, difficulty breathing, flushed or yellow skin, abdominal cramping and vomiting. So we've stepped up quite a bit from mild to some more severe symptoms. This might be how you're feeling after Friday night, so maybe Saturday morning after a night on the town. And then, of course, just the diagram here. Symptoms of pesticide poisoning can look like common illnesses, so cold, flu, food poisoning. You're just not feeling good, and those could very well be symptoms of poisoning. So severe symptoms would be very rapid breathing, high fever, muscle spasms, loss of reflexes, you've stopped breathing or become unconscious. This would be a very dangerous state to be in, especially if you're using something like aluminum phosphine, and if you're having these kind of symptoms, you're probably not far from, being dead. So symptoms such as the ones listed in the previous slide may develop in a matter of minutes, but most cases poisoning symptoms develop more slowly, depending on the route of entry and the amount absorbed. In some cases, it may take 24 hours or longer. The reason I use the example of something like Weevil-side, this has to do with your breathing and, the lack of oxygen intake. So it doesn't take long once you're not breathing properly or you're breathing in something other than oxygen. It can be pretty quick. So toxicity, this is the degree to which a substance or mixture of substances can harm humans or animals. You can have either acute toxicity or chronic. And we'll talk about both acute and chronic. You need to understand the difference between those two. Acute toxicity is defined as the ability of a substance to cause injury or death soon after a single exposure or dose. Can develop within a few minutes or days of exposure, results in rapid poisoning. Death can occur from a single exposure or multiple exposures over a limited time period. So maybe multiple exposures over a 24-hour period could result in acute toxicity. Can result in acute poisoning if a person becomes sensitized to the product through repeated exposure. Okay, so here's kind of an a diagram. Acute poison would be, you're exposed to it and now you're dead. Chronic would be, you've been exposed over time, maybe even years, and eventually you're dead. Or you have severe health issues that you're going to be dealing with the rest of your life. So LD50, many of you have maybe heard this term before, LD50. LD50 is defined as a single dose of poison expected to cause death to 50% of test animals within a specified time. Okay, so in your book, if you turn to 2-4, you'll see a table there that talks about LD50. I'll just give you, I'm assuming you're going to be looking at your book. So, aspirin, for example, would take 1,000 milligrams of product per kilogram of body weight to kill 50% of test subjects. Okay, so aspirin would be 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. That's aspirin. Table salt, 3,300 milligrams per kilogram. 2,4-D, 550 milligrams per kilogram. So as you can see in this table, the smaller the number, the more toxic it is. Okay, so if you look at Furidan, it's only 11 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Okay, so just to read that definition again, so LD50 is defined as a single dose of poison expected to cause death to 50% of test animals within a specified time. Okay, so here's a table. I just got it online. It shows you some of the different substances, where they're found, and shows the LD50 for these. So, for example, practically they've got this category as practically non-toxic. So with water, you'd have to, ingest 90,000 milligrams per kilogram. Okay, sucrose, table sugar. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things here. So just some interesting information for you to look at. Okay, chronic toxicity is the capacity of a substance to cause a long-term adverse health effects in humans, animals, fish, and other organisms. May be a complication of acute exposure, is a progressive condition, occurs as a result of long-term exposure of weeks, months, or years, may not be fatal, but can cause irreversible long-term disability or discomfort. Okay. So still here, another chronic toxicity, acceptable daily intakes of minimal concern. Just something I dug up off the internet for just some added information for you. Symptoms of chronic toxicity, skin rashes that do not clear up or reappear on slight exposure to a substance. This is a good example of chronic toxicity. I have it underlined in bold, so take note of that. So a skin rash that does not clear up or reappear on slight exposure to a substance. Okay. Respiratory ailments are coughing, nervous disorders, including weakness, dizziness, or disorientation. Now, I know in previous classes I've shared the story of a coworker I knew that I used to work with years ago before I've been with the county. So I worked for a lawn and tree care outfit, and one of the fellows who'd been there, probably almost from the beginning, He had told me that, from all the lawn care and the 2,4-D, that whenever he actually smells it, it causes a tightness in his throat. So that would be an example of a chronic toxicity. So when he's exposed to it, just the smell of it, it causes a restriction. So key factors that affect the amount of exposure and absorption. So basically, it's your attitude. The greatest risk of exposure occurs during mixing and loading. So, if you don't have if your attitude is, it's not a big deal. I don't need to put on the PPE. Just plug this in my tank, and it'll all be good. You have to understand, when you're mixing and loading, you're dealing with the concentrated chemical. Okay, that's the strongest, that's the strongest, most potent state that the chemical is in. So it's important when mixing and loading to wear the proper PPE. Be aware of the safety practices, the label, instructions, the application methods, because it really boils down to you and your attitude. Okay. Risk equals toxicity times exposure. So your risk can be minimized by choosing the least toxic pesticides and reducing exposure, right? So the more harmful pesticides you're using and the more often you're exposed to it increases your risk. Okay. So risk is the chance that the pesticide will harm someone or something. The risk of poisoning depends on the substance and your exposure to it. So least amount of exposure, least amount of risk. Preventing pesticide poisoning, some general precautions. Of course, always read the label before using. Don't eat and drink while using pesticides. Don't carry snacks on you when applying pesticides. Always wash your hands and face with soap and water before eating, smoking, or going to the bathroom. And wear the recommended PPE. Advise another adult that you're applying pesticides. Always shower thoroughly at the end of the day, including your fingernails. Fingernails can be a bad way to, if you bite your nails, to transfer pesticide into your mouth. Immediately wash off pesticide that has spilled on you. Wash your PPE daily with soap and water. Restrict access to pesticides. Store your pesticides in original or properly labeled containers. Ventilate pesticide storage areas and lock the building where you store your pesticides. First aid. If pesticide poisoning is suspected, first determine if poisoning was caused by inhalation, ingestion, or absorption. The most important thing, though, is that you protect your own self. Okay, you have to assure your own safety. Do not become a victim yourself and put on the appropriate PPE. There's too many stories, with sour gas, where someone has fallen and a coworker has rushed in to save them, and then they've, fallen, and you have to protect yourself. Okay, so inhalation poisoning. You'd move the victim to an uncontaminated area, call 911 if the victim is unconscious or having a seizure, determine if the victim is breathing, determine what happened and symptoms present. If conscious, you'd call the Poison Control Center and follow their instruction. I'm going to add, if you're calling the Poison Control Center, you have to have some information to give them. You have to know what it is they've been exposed to. If you just call them and say someone is, has been poisoned, and you don't know what they've been poisoned by, then they can't really help you. So you have to have the label or the MSDS or something else, or just knowledge of what has happened. Okay. Transport to hospital or wait for EMS and have that label with you. First aid for ingested pesticide. So always, protecting yourself. Okay. That's always the first step. Put on the proper PPE before doing anything. You'll continue by rinsing or wiping out the victim's mouth, especially if a powdered or solid formulation is involved. Call Poison Control Center for information and assistance. Follow their instruction, follow the label instructions if help is not available. Transport to hospital or wait for EMS. First aid for absorption on skin. Still protecting yourself first, putting on the proper PPE, remove the victim from the contaminated area, remove contaminated clothing. If the substance is liquid, you'll flush the eye with water for 15 minutes. If it's powder, brush off first before washing. Wash skin with soap and water and call the Poison Control Center. Eyes, still protecting yourself. Flushing eyes with lukewarm water, running water for at least 15 minutes. If only one eye is affected, you're going to position the victim so whether you're rinsing the infected eye, it doesn't contaminate the uninfected eye. Okay. And you can proceed to calling the Poison Control Center. First aid kits, keep in a convenient location, inspect and update regularly. Page 10 in your book, if you want to have a look, lists some items that are suggested for your first aid kit. All right, and that takes us to Module 3.